wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay back Mr. Twit for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch. She mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered in tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it tasty," said Mrs. Twit. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful, and then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard, with the corner of a tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it's got a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it's worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands, stamping her feet on the floor, and rocking with laughter. The funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed, took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of her stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so that the extra bits looked part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from 1 week to the next. And it was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's growing shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat. See how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly that she had to sit down. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet and by golly, the man was right. Her feet weren't touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck that little bit extra onto the stick, he'd done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went right white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there is nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "Oh, I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit, "the worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not much more than about 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything I can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "Well, there's only one cure for shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What must I do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons, and he'd fixed an iron ring onto the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring, and then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. Can you see? When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied round her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, some even to her hair. Soon there were about 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was quite unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a nasty, ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, with a ghoulish grin on his lips. He knelt down at her feet. He took out a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she cried. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is gone, lost and gone forever." But he wasn't right. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. It's the next chapter, and we'll have that in part 3.